They put me in the chair on the second morning of the colloquium, which was, I'd learn later, politest way they could find to tell me I didn't belong in the room. The Vaithoran Collegiate of Sovereign Adjudication was not built for auditors. It was built for magistrate candidates, the highest-ranked jurisprudential minds in 6 federation sectors, and the distinction mattered to them in ways I was still cataloging when senior adjudicator Proctor Sorvith Khan gestured toward me during the live demonstration session and said, in a voice that had probably never entertained the possibility of being wrong, that he would welcome a volunteer. The cohort of 12 candidates looked at me the way professionals look at an administrative error that has somehow acquired a seat. Then one of them. I never learned his name, only that his species communicated rank through the number of joints in their secondary fingers, raised a hand and said the word for the auditor in a tone that made it sound like a verdict already. Khan's cranial membrane flickered. Velthians carry their neural states on the outside. The membrane runs from above the eye line to the back of the skull, translucent enough to read if you know the spectrum. Blue is certainty, orange is agitation. The flat, even blue he wore told me he thought this was going to be quick, he said. The demonstration would take approximately 3 minutes. Want to be precise about what the verdict engine is, because the collegiate's literature is careful to describe it in terms that make it sound larger than it is. And I have a professional habit of reading past institutional language to the mechanism underneath. The engine is not a mind. It does not think. It is a pattern resolution system. It reads the full cognitive architecture of a subject, active memory, suppressed impulse, moral intent, ethical weighting, and it locates the dominant framework through which that subject makes decisions. Once it has the framework, it maps deviations from it. Deviations are guilt. Consistency is innocence. The verdict follows from the architecture. It had run 240 years without returning a null result. The collegiate mentioned this 3 times in the orientation materials. I counted. They sat me in the chair. The chair is not uncomfortable. Velthian design philosophy runs toward the ergonomic, and the interface array lowered around my temples without any particular drama. I have sat in evaluation chairs before. Correctional system used cognitive resonance instruments for 18 years before the courts ruled them inadmissible. And I spent most of those 18 years writing the reports that explained why the results they were returning didn't mean what the operators thought they meant. I knew what an evaluation felt like. I knew what a system felt like when it was working. I also knew what a system felt like when it had found something it wasn't built to process. The engine started. First sum was nothing, which is to say, the 3-minute mark came and went, and the readout panel above the chair remained blank. Cohort said nothing. Khan's membrane stayed blue. 3 minutes was the guaranteed envelope. Perhaps the human subject was simply toward the upper end of the processing curve. At 8 minutes, one of the candidates shifted in his seat. At 15 minutes, Khan checked the display twice. The membrane had acquired a thin line of orange along the left hemisphere, which he suppressed before I could be certain I'd seen it. I hadn't moved. There is nothing to do in an engine chair. You cannot cooperate with or resist the system. It reads what is there regardless, and I had learned, in a long career of sitting across tables from systems that were trying to understand me, that stillness was its own kind of information. I sat, and I waited, and I thought, with the particular quality of attention that 18 years in correctional systems review had given me, about what the engine was looking for. It was looking for the dominant thread. I have worked in moral philosophy only tangentially. It isn't my field. But the relevant point is one that anyone who has spent long enough evaluating human judgment instruments eventually arrives at. We do not have a dominant thread. I am not speaking loosely. I mean it as a structural fact. A human making a moral decision does not consult a primary ethical framework and apply it. He runs consequentialism and deontological commitment and tribal loyalty and self-interest and situational intuition all at once, simultaneously, in genuine tension, none of them resolved into a master hierarchy. The frameworks do not take turns. They do not defer to each other. They operate in parallel, all weighted, all live, all pulling. The engine was trying to find the one that was in charge. There isn't one. There has never been one. That is not a flaw in the architecture. It is the architecture. At 40 minutes, Khan called a brief recess. He used institutional language, recalibration interval, standard for extended subjects, nothing of concern. The membrane was solidly orange by then, suppressed again within the minute. But I had been watching it for long enough to read the lag between the suppression effort and the result. He was not accustomed to uncertainty. It showed in a Velthian the way it shows in any sentient organism under pressure, a narrowing of the control. Bandwidth, a slight increase in the lag between stimulus and response. I used the recess to get water. The magistrate candidates did not speak to me. I did not expect them to. The second day, I arrived at the chamber at the standard session hour and sat down in the chair again. A graduate researcher, young, Velthian, membrane a startled pale, asked if I'd had any incidents during the night. I told her I'd slept well. She wrote something down. The cohort rotated. Khan remained. I began to understand that I had become a different kind of project from the one I'd been assigned to audit. The engine ran continuously. I was present for 6 hours a day, processed the accumulated architecture data overnight, and the blank above the chair remained blank. Not error blank, not crashed blank, running blank. The system was operational, its throughput indicators nominal, query load higher than any prior subject, by a factor of 4 by the third day and climbing. It simply had not found what it was looking for. On the fourth day, the department head came to observe. She was older than Khan, Velthian, membrane a settled gray-blue that read, as someone who had moved past the stage of accepting outcomes and arrived at the stage of simply recording them. She watched for 2 hours and said nothing. Before she left, she asked me, in the careful phrasing of someone constructing a question for the record, whether I experienced my moral decision-making as unified or distributed. Thought about how to answer that for a long moment. Distributed, I said, irreconcilably. She wrote something down too. The magistrate candidates, by the 6th day, had stopped looking at me the way they looked at an administrative error. The specific quality of their attention had shifted. It was still clinical, still professional, but it had acquired the particular edge that very good analysts develop when they encounter a data set that isn't behaving as predicted. I recognized it. I had worn it myself many times, sitting across from a system that was returning results I hadn't anticipated. The difference was that I was now on the other side of the table. I won't pretend that wasn't interesting. I spent 18 years on the analyst's side. 18 years of being the one with the instrument and the report. There was something clarifying, at this stage of a career, about sitting in the chair instead, about being the variable the system couldn't resolve. I am not a sentimental man. I found that I did not mind it. On the 8th day, Khan asked me, not during a session, in the corridor outside the chamber, whether I would discuss myself as guilty of anything. It was not a small question. Coming from a senior adjudicator proctor of the Vaithoran Collegiate, it was probably the most significant question a subject could be asked in an informal register, and I understood that he was asking it because the engine had not answered it, and he needed professionally to understand why. I told him the truth. Probably. It depends on the framework. He stood very still for a moment. His membrane went briefly. Entirely white. Absence of categorizable thought, which I had read about in the technical literature but not seen in person, and then recovered. He said, "What do you mean depends on the framework?" I said, "The answer is different depending on which ethical system you use to evaluate the same set of decisions. I can give you a consequentialist answer, a deontological answer, a virtue ethics answer, and a contractualist answer, and they will not agree. I have been working on reconciling them for approximately 40 years I haven't managed it yet. I'm not certain it's possible." He looked at me for a long time. "The engine," he said carefully, "requires a dominant framework to render a verdict." "I know," I said. "That's the gap." He went back into the chamber. I got another glass of water and waited. On the 11th day, 2 days past the longest prior session in the engine's 240-year operating history, the output panel above, chair printed a single line. Not a verdict, not a guilt determination, not an innocence determination. A notation in the engine's own operational language, which I asked the graduate researcher to translate for me because my Velthian technical vocabulary did not Extend to jurisprudential classification. She read it twice before she answered. It says, she said carefully, subject architecture, multi-framework concurrent, verdict domain not resolvable within current parameters. Recommend parameter expansion. I nodded. I had expected something in that neighborhood. I filed my auditor's report with Khan that afternoon. It was a standard gap analysis document, the kind I had written several hundred times over the course of a career, identifying the engine's unresolved assumption that every sentient moral actor operates from a single dominant ethical framework, with deviations constituting guilt. Port recommended that the assumption be reclassified from foundational to contextual, and that a multi-framework processing module be developed for subjects whose architecture did not resolve to a single thread. It was not a dramatic document. Gap analyses rarely are. They are by nature the record of a thing that was nearly right for a very long time, and then met the exception it wasn't built for. Khan received it without expression. His membrane stayed the settled gray-blue of the department head, which I took as a professional compliment, the acknowledgement of a man who had moved past, expecting a particular outcome, and arrived at simply recording the one he'd gotten. I collected my materials and walked out of the Vathorin Collegiate of Sovereign Adjudication at the end of the standard session hour, the same way I had walked out of every evaluation chamber in 18 years of this work. The engine had needed 11 days. I had needed about 40 minutes on day one to understand what it was caught on, which is not a reflection on the engine. It is a very good system. 240 years it processed every architecture it was given without a gap. It simply had not been given this one before. That is the thing about judgment systems. They are built from the cases they have already seen. They are very good at those cases. They are very good, in fact, at everything except the case they haven't encountered yet. I have made a career out of that gap. I imagine the collegiate will too now.